What's up, Written and Stoners? So, our original plan was to take this week off. I was just going to do a short thanks and Merry Christmas, and that was supposed to be it. And as I was recording that intro, it occurred to me that I wanted to give you something, a Christmas gift of sorts for number one, for sharing the shit out of this thing like you have been, and that it might be fun to put together a list of all of the free climbing films from the 90s that I could find for you to watch over the holidays, a little nostalgia. And then it occurred to me that I was just having a text conversation with my friend Mike Call about documenting the history of the sport. And then, of course, like it tends to do, the idea just kept growing. And like I tend to do, I just rolled with it. You have to let the damn thing do what it's going to do. And now I know I've started all the other interviews this season with a story, but this one is a little bit different. And that's because Mike has told his story, intertwined with Boone Speed's story in his film, The Artist. And I have the link in the show notes so you can go watch it as soon as you finish listening. And I suggest you do that. And I'm glad he's got that out there because, frankly, I wouldn't even know where to start. There's pusher holds, shaping the boss, the first macro hold, probably the greatest and most influential hold ever shaped, co-designing and creating the Spot, one of the first crash pads, and almost certainly the first made to fold up and put on your back like a backpack, helping rebirth bouldering into the climbing consciousness, and along the way documenting it all. The PCA, Yank on This, Fast Twitch, Frequent Flyers, Momentum Video Magazine, all the while giving climbers like me in Cincinnati, Ohio, a glimpse of what climbing could be like if you were just willing to really go for it. Mike, man, welcome to Written in Stone. I'm psyched you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. It's been a while.
Yeah, man. You were just shooting in Bukes, is that right?
Yeah, we were doing a little prep for a historical film about the birth of climbing and or free climbing specifically, and
Yeah.
how it evolved into what it is today. So I was just doing some prep work with my good friend Mike Beck, who I grew up with, basically, and interviewing some of the players that are going to be in the film, and just kind of trying to wrap our heads around the big picture of what this could be. So kind
Very
of a
cool.
prep trip.
Yeah, I love to hear that. I love that you're also kind of zeroed in on the history of things and trying to educate all these new climbers about where all of this came from. I think that's such an important message to be getting out there.
Yeah, there's not a lot of there's so much information, I guess, that's out there, that I think that it's
Yeah.
almost overwhelming for the kids to kind of like follow the thread and figure out where this all came from. And you know, I find it fascinating. I've always been a total fan of the sport, and I love the history. I used to read magazines and just read the captions and try to understand who was doing what and
Yeah.
who did the first ascent of what and why that was cool and everything. I was lucky enough to be born into a generation of climbing when it was pretty narrow focus to the climbing magazines. I mean, there wasn't a lot
Mhm.
of information out there, so everything you got was extra important. And now there's so much information. It's like, well, who cares if so and so did this in 92, or who cares if she did that in 89 or whatever. It's like it's really easy to like dismiss it because it's overwhelming. But I think
Yeah.
it's really important to, well, actually, I don't know if it's important. I think it's satisfying to know where all this comes
Mhm.
from. I think that's the payoff, is it gives our sport more soul and more
Totally.
resonance to have something like these permanent monuments out there that you can go climb on, and you understand the history of it, and that you can respect what somebody did back in 1978 or what somebody did back in 85 or whatever. And it's like, wow, these dudes were strong and they had
Mhm.
crappy boot technology, and they were, they didn't have training programs, and they were just making it
Yep.
up as they went, and they were strong as shit. I mean, yeah, I mean, that video that somebody did with Ben Moon going back and revisiting Agincourt was like
Yeah.
amazing, because it's like even he was kind of surprised. He's like, oh yeah, this thing's nails.
Yeah, totally. And Agincourt has played a part in this season already, and after the holidays, it plays an even bigger part. And Bukes in general, really comes into the scene
Mhm.
during this Agincourt conversation that I'm having later. Um, so it's cool that you're going back and doing that. And a couple things there that you sort of reminded me of, like you said, you were reading all the magazines, and I was doing the same thing, like devouring everything I could. Um, but also, there's something interesting that came with the videos back then and the films back then. It wasn't like they are today necessarily, where you'd get like the preemptive, this is the route, this is the grade. A lot of the
Mhm.
films back then were just this long narrative, and then you had to wait for the credits
Yeah.
to see what the route was, who the climber was climbing that route, what the grade was. Sometimes the grade wasn't even there, or the thing
Yeah.
didn't even have a name yet. Um, so it was like reading liner notes on old records, to
Mhm.
find out who played the keys in this song or who
Totally.
played the drums in this song. Um, that's what it felt like to me, and I was so like I couldn't wait for the credits to see what the roots were and who the climbers were.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, it's an interesting thing to go follow that rabbit hole of you know, that there's something there, that that there's a cultural thing happening, and you want to be a part of it. And to be a part of it, you feel like, at least I did. I feel like I needed to know more, and I always wanted to know more. Like who is this Todd Skinner fellow? Who's this Didier Rabatou guy? And like all the players back then, you were just kind of like, holy crap! Like they're mythical, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, man, before we jump into this long list of questions that I have for you, um, I have to ask one question. If you could steal any past climbing moment of any era from another filmmaker, so you get to shoot it instead of them, what climbing moment would that be?
Oh man, that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the most seminal moments that I can think of in climbing history that was in my era anyway, that I wish I would have been there first for, or been there alongside him shooting this, was Clem doing Lost Cotton Two Smoking Barrels. Just
Wow,
because
that's a good one.
I was there, I was like Josh and I were kind of the two main people trying to do climbing films online back then, and um, I remember we put that out on Climax Media
Yeah.
first,
Yep.
and before it came out in the Dosage DVD, and I remember seeing that and just being like, "This is absolutely one of the coolest things I've ever seen." Like this was pre Sharma adopting it. This was like the first look at this new world, and it's
I
just
remember
like,
watching it on Climax Media.
do you?
Yeah, totally, sitting in my little basement with my dial-up internet.
Oh, dude, the resolution thing was a total nightmare. I mean, it was so brutal because I knew what that footage looked like, and it was still standard def footage. It wasn't like high def or 4K footage. It was like 320
Yeah,
by 240. But I remember looking at that and seeing how clean. I mean, Josh has always been a great shooter, and he was always such a great editor. He always has been.
yeah.
And to see that edit and then have to compress it down to Climax Media resolution was brutal. It was brutal because it's a beautiful film. I mean, it's just like and to see water as an element in a climbing film
Mm,
was such a relief. It was like this um, aesthetically just such a beautiful thing to suddenly have as an element in a climbing film, because you always have dirt in the
yeah,
background.
yeah,
You always
yeah.
have dust and dirt and rocks, and it's like to see the ocean just raging below these guys. It was just like, man, that's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. You know.
Wow, that's really cool. I it didn't even occur to me that you would go there, but that's such a fantastic answer. Wow. Um, I also have to know, after you co-starred in 3 Weeks and a Day, um, because that film was like the one for me that I watched damn near every night. I would watch it before every time I went climbing to get psyched. We listened to Deadbolt for probably a year and a half
Tiki
straight.
Man.
Tiki Man, exactly. Did you listen to Deadbolt as much as everybody else after that came out?
Dude, we while we were filming that, the producers, like one of the, I think it was the audio guy, had a copy of that on tape, and we were actually listening to that
Oh, nice.
album on the trip. and then they ended up incorporating it into the film. Like they went out and got the rights to it because it was so part of our trip, you know. And like that whole like dark rockabilly or whatever you call,
Yeah.
however you
Yeah, yeah.
categorize it. It was like that was our, like, we were way into it back then, you know.
That's
So
so cool.
yeah, we'd listen to it. I mean, we definitely, like, I think we'd probably get burned out on it pretty quickly, but it was definitely in the moment for sure.
Oh, man, it's all that played in the gym for, like, a year and a half. And actually, a quick funny aside here, I was working at Climb Time in Blue Ash at the time, the gym where, like, the ABS started, you know, in the '90s at some point, or late '90s maybe, and I was working there, and, like, a Cub Scout group or a birthday party or something came in. And I remember the manager being like, "Hey, go switch the music." Deadbolt was playing. They're like, "Go switch the music. I don't know if this is gonna be appropriate for this birthday party." So I go into the back and I'm like rifling through the CDs or whatever it was. And I'm like, "Oh, this one will be fine. It's a soundtrack. You know, there won't be anything bad on this. It's fine." So I put in the Pulp Fiction soundtrack instead of Deadbolt. And as I'm walking out to the birthday party, this is what plays.
I love you, pumpkin.
I love you, honey bunny.
Everybody be cool, this is a robbery!
Any of you fucking pricks move! And I'll execute every motherfucking last one of you!
Amazing.
All the little kids' eyes were like
Oh, you changed
saucers.
lives, man. You changed
All the
lives for
parents
sure.
were like, "What the fuck did you just do?"
Yeah, not necessarily an improvement over Deadbolt.
No,
That's
not at
awesome.
all.
But it's funny that it still has that surf rock sound.
I know, no, same sound, and that's probably why it was sitting up there. Like, we were so into that sound just
Yeah.
because of that Deadbolt soundtrack from
It's
3 Weeks
funny,
of the Day.
rockabilly, that was a moment back in the 90s. It was like there was a lot of that, you know, floating around on snowboarding
Yeah,
videos and skateboarding
yep.
videos, and like, yeah, it was cool. It was really cool.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. I'm positive we aren't gonna get to half of it, but I wanna really start with you, and I kinda wanna, like, how long had you been climbing before you started filming it, and what on earth inspired you to do that?
Yeah, you know, I don't really know what year I picked up my dad's camera, but my dad had one of those old white high 8 Sony Handycam video cameras, and it was kind of new tech back then, and not, you know, like video cameras, like home video cameras used to be these big things, and you know, you'd
Massive,
see like
yeah.
soccer dads walking around with them on their shoulders and stuff, and I think they were maybe Super VHS or something. And then my dad got this little toy, and we used to, like, you know, I would like walk around my house with it when I lived at home, and I would just like record something and then play it back on the TV and just be fascinated by the idea of filming, and
Mm,
you know, just the process of it was interesting to me. Like, oh wow, you know, like capturing moments. And I never had a photographic background or a filmmaking background or anything in school, but I just thought it was interesting. And then I would be climbing, and I think my dad brought his camera to the opening of the Body Shop, which is the first climbing gym here in Salt Lake, and maybe one of the first three in the whole country.
yeah.
And then he took some footage of that opening day, and then I ended up keeping the camera, and I just ended up, like, I had moved out at that point, and I was um, just filming me and my friends. I mean, honestly, that was it. It was just kind of like, I just thought it was interesting to kind of like shoot footage, because I thought, like, I didn't know what it was, but I knew there was something there, and I knew I loved it, and I wanted to record it, and I thought that it was at first I thought it would just be interesting for us to look at, you know. I think
Mhm.
that was the main thing, and then really the first video I did was essentially an extension, like a cut down version of that idea. Instead of having to make people watch all my tapes, like, oh look, this was that day we went to Joe's Valley for the first time or whatever. It was like,
Right.
um, I'm just going to put this together and compile it so that it's like all the best parts or the most interesting, funny parts or whatever. And so that's kind of like where it started. It was just like a way to show my friends like a distilled version of all the stuff we've been shooting. And, you know, it wasn't just me filming. Like, you know, Boone would pick up the camera, or, you know, like my friend Craig would pick up the camera, whoever would the camera would just be sitting there in a bag. And if something was happening, somebody
Right.
would pick it up and just start filming. So, I mean, a lot of that first stuff that was in my first videos was shot by all my friends and I, like, it wasn't just me. So it wasn't precious. It wasn't like intentional, like, oh, let's make a film. It was like, we're just fucking around, you know?
Yeah. Well, it seems like, and maybe my timeline is very compressed because that's what we tend to do when we only know, bits and pieces of what people are doing. But it seems like pretty quickly out of the body shop came Pusher,
Hmm.
and you and Boone and Dave Bell and what was the other guy's
Rob
name?
Gilbert.
Bob.
Hmm.
Yeah. We're all involved there. So were your early years of filming, like, was most of that in, like, pursuit of marketing Pusher? Is that what
100%.
those early
Well,
things were?
actually, it was kind of an excuse to continue to make these videos because, like, I was like, I made that first video, and then it was like, I was at the same time we were starting Pusher. So I think we had started Pusher before I even launched that first VHS tape. And so, because I was so immersed in Pusher, it was like, well, of course, we'll just slap a Pusher, like, we'll just say it's sponsored by Pusher. And,
Right.
we followed a lot of the skateboarding industry
Yeah,
models.
that's what I was gonna
So
ask, yeah.
it's like, I mean, we were obsessed with skateboarding and snowboarding, and we'd watch everything we could get. And, like, that's why I was biting a lot of copyrighted stuff. And it was just like, people were doing that back then. It was just like very normal, like, punk rock
Yeah,
shit to do. It's just like, there's nothing precious about it. In fact, the less precious it was, the more authentic it felt and the better it was. And, you
totally.
know, it looks, it looks handmade, and it's supposed to.
Yeah, those years of Pusher and, like, Boone's photos and your films, um, that, like, following your own artistic vision to create this thing really had an impact on me in Cincinnati, Ohio. Like, I'm still a fairly new climber at the time, and I don't know if I've ever told you this. I told Boone. You remember the Boone's second cover photo? It was you were belaying him.
On at the curse.
Yep, and he's got on this, like, wide headband, you know? Well,
Yeah.
I had long hair back then as well, believe it or not, and that wide headband, I saw that and I was like, "Oh, I know what I'm gonna do." And I went to every thrift store in town and I bought every, like, cool color and pattern turtleneck I could find and cut the necks off to make wide headbands, and then I sold them at the gym, and that was, like, my first little
Amazing.
climbing business,
Holy shit, that's crazy.
totally inspired by that photo of Boone and what you guys were doing, like,
Wow.
follow your vision, do whatever you wanna do, and somehow make money from it. Like, that
That's
seemed really
awesome.
cool to me, so thanks for that. Like, did you
Yeah.
know you guys were having that sort of impact when you were making these things?
No, I mean, not at first. Like, I think we sold maybe 150 copies of Yank on This on VHS or something, So that
Mhm.
it was like, to me, I couldn't believe 150 copies were out there in the world. So I was always surprised when somebody was like, "Oh, I saw you guys' video," and I was like, "Whoa, that's crazy," And I was the one
Yeah.
hand shipping every single one of these VHSs in a little envelope out the door. So I'd see them go out
Mm.
to, like, Cincinnati or wherever else, but it was like,
Yeah.
it's like disconnected until you meet that person and they're like, "Oh, we watched this video. It's like, it was really inspiring," or whatever, like, it was funny or whatever they wanted. It's like, it was pretty interesting to me to think that we were creating an audience, that there was an audience for any of this stuff. I think we were always pretty humbled by it. Like, you know, we knew we were just fucking around, and we knew that we weren't backed by any money, and we knew that we just thought nobody really cared, but it was still fun for us to do it anyway. It was kind of a fun experiment. And
Mhm.
I was pretty entrepreneurial at the time. I was 100% focused on trying to help Pusher become a actual business and make money and pay myself, because I was like, it was eat what you kill. I didn't have, Pusher wasn't funded. It was like every dollar we made had to go back into the business to grow it. And I was pretty focused on the growth of Pusher and helping it become healthy. So the Pusher videos were kind of my creative outlet to just be like, and shaping too, but like, the videos were just a fun side project that I would do at night at home. And
Yeah.
And it wasn't like I wasn't sitting at the pusher offices editing that stuff, you know?
Right, right. Yeah, that's very cool. That I mean, that's sort of what birthed my music as well. Like rapping about climbing seemed like a totally fucking absurd thing to do, but it was and I mean, it was an absurd thing to do, but it was like, this is a thing I enjoy. Can I combine the 2? The
Mhm.
same way those guys are combining their photography or their, sculpture and
Mhm.
their filmmaking into climbing, so
Yeah.
yeah, and I remember we had at the gym, we had a tiny little, like, TV VHS combo, you remember those?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it was sitting on the counter or behind the counter, and we would play videos, like, it would be Yank on
Sure.
This is playing or, 3 Weeks in a Day are playing, and people, instead of climbing, would stand at the counter and watch the films, you know?
That's
So,
amazing.
yeah, it was so cool to think that there were these guys out there in Salt Lake or wherever doing these rad things, and we get to watch it in this little industrial park in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool to hear. I mean, I love picturing that.
What was the shooting and editing like? You just mentioned these things are being released on VHS. Like,
Oh,
I
man.
have a 3 Weeks in a Day VHS right here. Um,
So 3 Weeks in a Day was actually shot by this production company in Provo. Some kids coming out of the Provo, the BYU Film School, and they just wanted to do. I think it was like their first professional film. So they shot most of that on 16 millimeter film, and they had a couple of high 8 Bolex cameras, or Super 8 Bolex cameras that. And then there was some video we shot with it because I had my camera and Sherry was dating a guy named Craig who had a video camera. So we were shooting our own stuff and they incorporated some of that into the video. But that was professional. Like they had a real sound guy on that shoot. They had a good DP on that shoot. And, they spent some money on that thing and they bought that RV just for the show and then they
the
sold it.
Land Shark.
The Land Shark, yep. And then they had to repaint it and they sold it to one of the producer's parents or something. I can't remember. But I mean, at the same time that was happening, I was shooting my own first video and I was just about to release Yank on This, which was at the same time these guys were making that. So it was pretty concurrent,
Yeah.
And but the way I was doing it was I had a box of tapes and I would literally fill the tape up with that,
Were
you
these like
know,
mini DV tapes? What were
they were high
the
eight tapes that they were way
Got it.
before mini DV. Yeah, I mean it was yeah, high eight it's actually a pretty stable medium, but it's like low resolution and really you don't have a lot of latitude in the colors. Like it's blown out, it's dark, it's like it's all automatic. There's nothing you
Yep.
can do with the focus. It's just going to do what it does. And but the beautiful thing is you just pick it up and roll. You don't have to think. You just turn it on and go, and
Yeah.
you get what you get. And so I had a box of tapes, and then I would go home and put it on my combination VHS TV set, and I
Yeah.
would look at the time code as it was coming up on the screen, and I would see a scene or a moment that I liked, I would literally write 1 minute 30 seconds 5 frames to 1 minute 35 seconds 7 frames, and then I'd give that a number based on the tape. So the tape would be tape one, and then that would be the first cut. So basically, I was teaching myself nonlinear editing without knowing that that's what I was doing. And then no one in Salt Lake had a nonlinear editing system at home. No, that was not just. It was way before that time. The
Right.
storage was too expensive. So I knew somebody that had a video toaster editing system, which was pre-Avid. Like it was kind of this new school nonlinear editing digital system where you could do
Got it. So you weren't
proper.
having to, like, splice tape and all of that to do it.
No, no. So they would ingest just this because storage was so expensive.
Yeah.
I remember that first editor had a 10 gig hard drive, and that was mind blowing to us because I had like a
Totally.
512 megabyte computer or something, or I don't even know if I owned a computer yet, honestly. Anyway, so this sounds like I'm talking about the dinosaurs times, but anyway, so we'd ingest just enough footage to, not take up the whole space on her hard drive. And then I would say, okay. And she was charging me, I think it was $75 an hour, which was a huge discount. It was half the rate because she knew I was broke. And I would sit in there and I was like, okay, I've got $150. We got 2 hours. Let's make this happen. So I was like speed editing. I was like, okay, go to this tape, put in this clip and put it here. And then like we'd lay the whole thing out in an hour. And then she'd be like, she just looked at me. She's like, do you mind if I just go through and just try to like make sense of this? And I was like, so we'd go through and like, she's like, why don't we put this clip here? And I was like, no. And, and I mean, it was like, basically I would just fight with her a little bit, but mostly she was trying to help me just at least give it some kind of like fade
Yeah.
ins and fade outs and kind of stuff, basic for producing. So yeah, at the end, it was like, I think I edited that whole first video in 2 hours, and it shows.
Well, I actually just watched Yank on this last night, preparing for
Wow.
this. And it's actually kind of fun, and it forces you to really pay attention to try to figure out like, okay, here's this quick, shot change. Who is this climbing now?
Right.
It's kind of interesting to have to do that instead of mindlessly just being told every single
Yeah.
time something changes that this is the climber, this is the grade, this is the boulder.
Hmm.
It was actually it forced me to have to really like absorb it, to then wait for the credits and be like, okay, this climber,
Yeah.
this climber.
It's interesting. I've talked to Boone about this a little bit, and it was a real stream of consciousness kind of piece, and it had all the illegal shit in it, and like whatever. Like it was like all the music wasn't cleared. Everything about it was like
Sure.
as punk as it could get, because I
Yeah,
literally
yeah, yeah.
didn't think anyone would ever watch it. And um, at the same time, there is something about it that's like, it's not easy listening. It's difficult listening. Like you kind of need to engage yourself into it. So it's jarring. It's like, the more that I know about editing, the more I can look back at it and analyze it and kind of understand why, it sort of works, sort of like it's just, it is full contact viewing. And I think that's kind of cool. And it does have that, my history in music and growing up, I was into skateboarding and stuff. And I liked disruption, and I think
Mhm.
that's kind of like what the editing style is best described as. It's just nothing is smooth, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, from a climber's point of view, when I was watching it, there's a clip in it, a very short clip of Boone trying this dihedral. It's in the same spot where the guy takes the big fall
Yep,
off the top, like mantling. Is that the dihedral that just got done recently?
yep, yep. Just that's Jack Horner.
Yeah,
So that was an early attempt right before he did Jack Horner, and I wasn't there to film Boone's first ascent of it. But that footage is actually the only footage that shows the real start that Boone used. But like Sam Tingey repeated Jack Horner maybe 10 years ago or 12 years ago. But people were like, well, he started one hold higher, and Sam's a tall guy and he's got a long span. So maybe he started higher than I wasn't like playing referee with all this stuff. Somebody recently did a sit down start to Jack Horner too, which eliminates all
got it,
confusion. I can't
got
remember
it.
who did it.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of then. I remember seeing a couple of people do it just recently.
Back into vogue. I mean, Little Cottonwood's going through a really interesting period of the last 10 years, and all the talent that's moved to Salt Lake because of the training center, they're, bored and they go up the canyon. They can have fun. Like Zach Gala, all these guys are so strong, can go up there and just put up new V13s and 14s and 15s and,
Totally.
stuff none of us could touch back then.
Well, I'd be absolutely remiss if I didn't ask while we're still in this early era, like talk to me about shaping the boss. Like I've got one in my gym. It was the only hold. That's not true. There were two holds that I were like, I have to have these holds in my gym, period. And it's a
Yeah,
newer pour. I wish I had an old, like
an original.
heavy, chipped up pour. But it is a newer one. So talk to me about the boss.
So Mark Russo and myself and Ivan Green and Mark Eller took a trip to Paris to go to Font for the first trip, our first trip. And I had studied photos of Mark Lemenestrel climbing on those boulders and just like thought it
Mhm.
was just the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And we ended up going and climbing, and we were all just, it changed our lives. Obviously, it was like, holy shit, this is what, good bouldering really looks like. And
Yeah.
there was a problem there. Like one of the big three is called the Big Boss. And there's like, I don't know, there's like three like classic V9, V10 boulders right next to each other in this one zone. And Cuvier. And anyway, so we love that they called these big slopey jug features or slopey features bosses on it. Like I mean, that's what we thought
Mm.
they were calling them anyway. None of us spoke French, but boss was like a thing they would call, and like there was this problem that we took some footage and photos on, which had that classic font elephant skin. And we, Mark and I were really creative together, and Russo is a super important element in this whole thing. Like he basically roughed in the size and the dome of the boss and started carving the elephant skin, because we were both just like, how do you make your hand on a sloper not pinch? Like how do you
Right.
force that open-handed slope?
These holds were so small back then. Like that's
Yeah,
a
everything had a thumb catch or a
yeah,
bolt hole. So it was like, we were trying to force that open-handed technique of like just smashing your hand against something and dropping your elbow, because you can't just crimp it, you can't pinch it, you have to just purely oppose it.
yeah,
So it was kind of a project that we both whittled away at for a week or two. And, it was literally like I'd be in the office, taking orders, and then I'd walk back in there and I'd spend 45 minutes tweaking the elephant skin, or he would like go back there and tweak something. And it was a very collaborative thing. I mean, Mark had a huge, like we both shaped that together. And he's so reclusive that, I don't even know if he's on social media. I don't think he is, but like he deserves like every bit of as much credit on that thing as I have. But
that's
anyway, so we were almost done with it. And the whole thing used to have elephant skin on the whole dome. And then I was like, well, that doesn't make sense to waste all this plastic for only one option. It's basically the same all 360. So I basically took a photo of Mark Leministro climbing on this boulder problem in font, where he's doing that exact angle that old hold had, this like perfect open-handed, no thumb indention,
yeah,
smooth side. And I basically put that feature onto the opposite side, onto one side of the feature, so that it had an option. And I think that's one of the things that really works with that hold, is that you have all these
yeah,
different variants you can do with that hold. You can like, turn it into a side pull feature or like a mantle feature or whatever. But
yeah. When you flip it, it becomes a different hold.
yeah, yeah. And after a while, the guys in the pouring room started making tweaks of that hold, where they jam stuff behind the mold to change the shape of it. And they came up with the baby boss and the
Yep, short
beast, and
poured it, and
yeah,
yeah,
short poured it. That became like, I think they did a whole set. We did a whole set of holds that were like, I don't know, 8 or 10 holds that were monster sized, but different variations on the boss.
yeah. And just to like explain to some of the people listening who weren't around in the '90s, like holds back then were generally pretty small and they
Yeah.
were pretty heavy. They were this solid, um, really chippable material, and that was the first hold that was macro, that was like
Mhm.
big. And now you walk into a gym and every hold you see,
Yeah.
even if
Yeah.
you can only use a small part of it, is massive.
Yep. Well, and it's interesting to look at what people are doing with volumes, right? Like
Yeah,
the wooden volumes. It's like taking that idea and extrapolating even bigger and bigger and bigger, and making it more cost effective, so you could put these
yep,
giant hollow shapes on the wall and change the entire geography of the wall. And
yeah,
and
totally.
I think that's really cool. I mean, it's cool to watch what's gone on with the hold industry, and they like everybody. It's an obvious aha moment where you're like, oh, this changes the entire like shape of this wall or the angle of this wall, because you got this giant dark target shaped volume on it. So
Yeah,
suddenly, what was the slab is now steep, or vice versa.
yeah, change the game for sure.
Mhm.
Um, Sort of last question about this era, like last specific question that I just want to know because I'm a nerd and I love knowing these little factoids. That footage of Stephen Jeffries dropping out of the rafters onto the campus board. Did you shoot that?
No, he shot that himself, actually.
Did he?
So this was kind of a common thing with the Yank on this series, was people would just have cool footage, and they knew that I was putting out videos, and they would just give me the footage to put in the videos. So Steven was really good at creatively shooting what he was up to, and he was a beast back then. I mean, he was like,
Monster.
he could keep up with Jim Carr, and he could keep up with Chris Sharma. Like they would come to, like, all the best climbers in the world would come here for the outdoor retailer trade shows, and Steven could hang with anybody, and especially on slopey things. But I mean, he was a beast back then. So he shot that drop himself, and I was like, this has to go into. I think I put it in High Life, but yeah, that was cool footage. I think a
Yeah,
lot of
very
people
cool.
emulated that. I mean, it's like it looks like a surefire way to blow up your elbows, but
Among other things.
yeah.
Um, and that sort of brings me to another question, like, watching the films and not knowing Steven personally, like, he's a very quiet, sort of understated guy, as Chris is, as, Boone can be, um, but they all turn on this, like, massive intensity
Mhm,
when they climb. Um, was Steven, like, the most intense climber of the whole group? He seemed like it in
mhm.
film. And I'm just curious what it was like watching not only him, but all of them turn on that intensity.
It's funny. Salt Lake has a real, and I don't know if this is true of all the different scenes, but Salt Lake had this real legacy of being like humble bragging. It was kind of like,
Mhm.
it was very competitive. I mean,
Sure.
you know, Dave Bell basically invented Pusher because everybody could burn him off on crimps, and he wanted to make holds that nobody else could hold on to that he could win.
Right,
Like he
right.
wanted to beat people, and it was all in good fun. But you know, Steven would hang back. Like it's funny calling him intense because he's more of a silent assassin. Like he would
Yeah.
watch what Jim Carn or Boone or Dale or one of these guys were doing, and then he'd like, he was like he'd sit back and just watch, and then he would just walk up and do it. And it was just like his favorite thing to do is to burn those guys off because it was like he grew up idolizing them, and then he surpassed them, and it was so fun for him to like just stroll up and just smash a problem that the great Jim Carn was struggling on or trying to do too. It's like he loved that. So the competition was there. It was just in this kind of low key, like I want to burn off my friends kind of vibe.
Yeah, Boone told me once that when you guys showed Jerry and Ben Joe's Valley, that it was a similar situation that you're like, "Oh, we're gonna bring Steven up here and have him, just crush these guys."
Yeah, I mean, Steven was definitely one of the main guys developing like all the new stuff in Joe's, and I think he definitely found Black Lung first, and I think he'd been trying it, but he showed Ben and Jerry that thing, and then Ben just was like, those the Brits are like shameless about like they all want to do the hardest things, and there's no embarrassment about it. It's like no,
Totally.
I'm not leaving here until I do this problem, and that's
Yeah.
where Ben was at. He was like, and I don't think he was necessarily trying to do it before Steven. It was just like Ben knew he could do it, and he knew it was a new level of difficulty for Joe's Valley, and we were out to make a video, so we were shooting Black Lung at the time, and Ben was obsessed and just wouldn't, he wouldn't stop going back to it. And I think Steven might have even done the second ascent of that thing. I don't even know, but he was fairly close, I think. But that's what makes great climbers the best is they're the ones that actually do it.
Yeah. You just you forced me into asking another question here. You did the Black Lung video, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah, super super classic moment in, like, I think that was, like, 2000 maybe, late '90s, early
yeah,
2000s.
yeah. I think so.
Inescapable moment. Black Lung was a real moment for the climbing, industry community. And just recently, I discovered Blung. Have you heard of this?
Mm-mm.
So Blung is a variation of Black Lung in which you do, I think, just the first move of Black Lung, and then you jump out to that sloper. And in your film, there's footage of like my thought was, oh, Ben just didn't notice that sloper. But in the footage, there's Ben is standing, I think, on somebody's shoulders, and he's holding that sloper while brushing the crimp next to it. Which essentially has turned Black Lung into an eliminate.
Interesting. Huh. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really followed what's been going on with that route. I know that there are variations to Resident Evil, and I know that you can actually, I think you can jump to the Waco at the top of Resident Evil as well off of Black Lung. But
Mm.
it's funny. I just saw something.
I
Maybe
think
it was
Jason Cale was the one who sort of pioneered the jump to the sloper.
that might be right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Like somebody just did it maybe last week. I saw on social media, and um, might have been Sean Bailey or something. I don't know. I mean, he just hiked it, just
Yeah, of
crushed it,
course.
and of
Yep.
course, but maybe it's more like going back to what we were talking about earlier, where it's like these things are monuments or art pieces on their own. And yeah, it might be a variant, but it's kind of cool to do the problem that Ben did, like
Yeah.
his way. And if you're strong enough to do it both ways, why not, experience
Yeah.
that too?
Of course. I think that's just a natural progression. Like climbers get
Hmm.
better and better and better. They're going to find new ways, different
Totally.
ways.
Yeah, there's new movement philosophies in bouldering that helps those kind of moves get easier. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah,
the tech that people are using now for training for bouldering and the comp style problems, it's like it's certainly going to open up a whole new realm of how to do these old problems in a whole new
totally.
way that makes them much easier.
Totally. So, were you like mainly shooting your group of friends back then, or when you traveled to, say, Font, were the locals getting in, like sneaking into the films? Were you looking for international climbers to shoot back then?
Um, I think, Mark Russo and I started Smack Magazine, which was the first online multimedia magazine ever. And it was during the dial up era when it was impossible to
Yeah,
get high resolution anything. So maybe once a week we'd put out a little tiny thumbnail video of somebody doing something. So I was trying to make that relevant at the same time as doing Pusher and doing my own videos. And, it was just like this creative expression that Mark and I had. And I wanted to do relevant things for sure. I wanted to shoot things that were happening in the bigger climbing world. And I mean, having Ben and Jerry on Black Lung and shooting Yuji Hirayama and Francois Legrand when we did
oh, when
our
they traveled the US.
yeah, when we this film called The Professionals. And like that, they were all like my heroes growing up. I mean, those guys were like beyond mythical to me. And they were also relevant in the moment too. Like they were the strongest people in the world at the time. And so I was always trying to shoot what I thought was interesting and relevant to the bigger audiences. But I mean, to start with, it was just me and my friends, of course.
Man, I totally forgot about the professionals. I don't know how that slipped my mind. Like, that was a cool moment too, like, because they got shut down on a few things.
Oh yeah, most of it.
Yeah.
It's funny. I just saw Francois in Buchs last week or 2 weeks ago, and he's great. His son is a crusher. His son's climbing 9As. Like
Mhm.
Francois still out there bolting roots in Buchs. He's a total lifer. He's like completely. It's not just that he was the world champion for 10 straight years or whatever it was. I
Yeah.
mean, he fundamentally loves rock climbing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that sort of the thread that runs through all of those, like, superstars of the '90s was, as I do more and more research, I just keep reading, one of the things that made him so good is he just loved climbing, or the thing that
Yeah,
made her so good was she loved climbing and was just a lifer, was just absorbed into the community wherever they went.
yeah,
Um, and I don't know if we can say that about the strongest climbers nowadays who come out of the gyms. I'm not trying to disparage that at all.
mhm,
I just think it's a different time where it's easier to come out and climb hard things, and you don't have to really dig into the community and travel across the world to find the next hardest thing.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's true.
that's an interesting thing, and Francois plays a fun part in an episode I just made about, the French versus the British and kind of this back and forth that they had. He sorta gets the last word years later,
Yeah,
um, and that comes, I think, end of next month,
cool.
yeah, it's such an interesting thing to, like, see that all those superstars are still at it.
Yeah. Yeah, Jibe is still out there, like, doing first ascents. I mean, we went and climbed with him for a few days in Oregon. Like, they're all just 100% lifers. And, Jibe's kids all climb hard. They're super, like, they're just a climbing family. And it makes me happy to see that, if you have an idea of who your heroes are, and then you see them out there actually just doing the dirty work of building a trail or, bolting a new route. And you just realize they're just like us, they're just like, they just happen to be better at it than us, but like
Yeah,
they love it
yeah,
just as much. It's cool.
totally. Alright, I got a series of questions here. Most impressive non-American thing you saw in the 90s
Whew.
on your travels? Like, in person saw?
Oh man.
I know I didn't prep you with this one, so take your time.
Yeah, I mean, in the 90s.
Or in that general era. I kn If you're anything like me, like, the '90s blur into the 2010s,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. Well, it's funny because my first, like my professional career started really when I think about it being professional when I did frequent flyers. So that was 2000. But gosh, I watched Jibe when he did the first ascent of Cannibals in Hell,
Mm,
and that was during the snowboard competitions when Todd Skinner was coming in and doing Burning, and Lynn Hill did the second ascent of it, and like that was just our first taste of international levels of climbing. Like we watched Didier Rabitou almost do the first ascent of what is now Dead Souls,
mm,
and just the power he had was just mind blowing. Like we were just like, holy crap, this dude! Like I've never seen anybody climb with so much force at that time, and I was like, that was pretty mind blowing. So
yeah.
my first international kind of mind bending experience was at my home crag. These guys at that level who were climbing AP plus already, and the standard in Salt Lake was 13C maybe was the hardest thing at the time. But to watch these guys climbing 514s and putting up hard routes on our turf, and then we're able to immediately get on the routes and try them and see how it compared. It was like you could really tell how far ahead of us the French were at the time. You know.
I hadn't thought about this, but it's super important to have those folks come over and do those things because you've got a guy like Boone there
Mhm.
in Salt Lake who, if given the right sort of training ground, which would be these harder routes, he's going to excel.
Mhm.
Um, but it's a much harder thing to excel when the hardest route there is 13C and it's up to you
Right.
to create the next level.
That's the whole thing is like Boone was bolting his own hard routes. And he was like, he could repeat the hardest things when you go travel on the road to other areas. Like he spent time in Bukes and he did really well there. And he did well in Smith Rocks and he did well, when he'd travel anywhere. But he realized that if he was going to climb really hard, he's going to have to find these routes and bolt them himself because there just wasn't the options back then. And that's another thing about like going back to what we were talking about earlier with the gym generation. They don't have to discover. They have it handed, like it's all in guidebooks and apps on their phone. Like people can go walk up to any crag in the world and dial up the hardest routes at that area on their phone and not have to like have that creative spark of like, shit, I've got to hike a 60-pound pack up that 45-minute hike to get to that crag and then find a route and clean it and bolt it and prepare it and then try it and hope it's the right grade for me. And, like there's just, there's an adventurous side to that I feel like, not to sound like an old man shouting at clouds, but I feel like there's something about that that's really rewarding. It's like, it's not just that it's like, you should go bolt routes. It's like, no, it's actually kind of a really cool aspect of this thing is like putting yourself on the line, doing what Boone and Jeff Patterson and those guys did, where they were like going up to entirely new cliffs like the Virgin River Gorge and being like, well, I think that we can climb this. And maybe that era is over. I don't know. Maybe that was just by necessity what we had to do to find climbing areas and to create climbing for ourselves. But I feel really lucky that we were born during that time. I mean, I think Boone does too, and Jeff Pedersen's told me the same. It's like we were just doing what was fun to us.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, bringing Jeff into the conversation is interesting because one of the things I've been sort of realizing throughout this season is while my initial idea was to highlight the person who did this first thing, that it's so much more than that. And I got into this in the Action Direct versus Hubble episode, where I think it's more important that there were these groups of people all pushing each other
Hmm.
around this common goal. Like maybe there's a Boone Speed and a Jeff Pedersen and a Bill O'Ran and whoever else out there, all trying to bolt the next hardest thing, all trying to do the next hardest thing. And then later there's Sharma and Steven and Obi and Jared all pushing each other in
Hmm.
the same spaces to do the next hardest thing. And
Completely.
that's more important than who sort of becomes the cover person for it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's far too much emphasis put on who does something first. I just saw something today that somebody made a T-shirt called "Nobody Cares If You That You Climb 513," and I thought it's brilliant because it's basically the ego and the false sense of who your personality is, like what your personality is based on how hard you climb, is the most false target ever because no one gives a shit. Really, what I think is more inspiring than almost anything. And granted, you got things that Adam Ondra is doing, or Seb Boone or whoever these people are doing are incredibly inspiring because they're pushing the levels. But beyond that, like none of us are really climbing that hard, and nobody really cares. But what does matter are the people who are putting up new routes, keeping access open, maintaining these routes, keeping good relationships with land managers, and allowing us to be as selfish as we are on our weekends. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing to me. And maybe I'm just again sounding like an old man shouting at clouds, but it's like that's the stuff that really does make an impact on the general, even if it's unsung, even if no one knows about it. Like to me, when I think about people like Bill Boyle, who bolted probably 70% of the routes in Utah and City of
Right.
Rocks and Red Rocks. I mean, nobody knows who Bill Boyle is, and
Right.
he doesn't care. He loves doing it. He's a workaholic, and he is so, um, you know, I mean, I can't think of a more prolific route developer that I know of that's done more to generate our sport than him. And he doesn't, he climbed, at his peak, he was climbing 513, but it wasn't like he was out to climb the hardest things. He just wanted to climb everything.
Yeah, totally. I'll also add to that, like, it's also inspiring, beyond the Adam Aldras and Seb Booins, to see anybody, like, really pushing themselves and trying hard and trying to do the thing and going for it. Like, I think that's one of the things I really loved when I first saw 3 Weeks in a Day is there was, was his name Dave that was
Mhm.
there that was climbing like 11D,
Mhm.
like that was his project. And
Yeah.
he's talking about how Boone convinced him to go for it. And,
Mhm.
for me being a relatively new climber, I think I've been climbing a little over a year at that point. It was like, wow, that's cool. Like, here's this guy pushing into 512 at the same
Mhm.
place that I am, and he's on this climbing film.
Yeah,
So that was really cool to see, and that inspires me just as much as the person who's the
totally.
first to do a thing.
I think that's the thing that Sharma did so well that had one of the biggest influences that he made the biggest influence with is how hard he tried and how he didn't care about climbing, like getting scrappy. And that is inspiring to a beginner because you can realize how much harder you can actually try, and pushing out of your comfort zone and trying harder is actually more important than being stronger. And I think that stuff does translate. And Chris is a special case. Like I think he's a pretty unique um, translator of climbing to humans because I think it's inspiring. Even if you can't climb 515D, there's something about him you're kind of like you want to emulate.
Yeah, to watch that effort level that he
Hmm.
puts in. Well, I was introducing Boone at a comp once years ago. It was like a gym opening and a comp, and Chris was there as well, I believe. But I was introducing Boone. I was emceeing the event, and Boone's like, "Dude, none of these kids are gonna know who I am," you know. And I was like, "I got this. Hold on." And I was like, "Boone Speed was Chris Sharma before there was Chris Sharma."
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And I think that sort of clued everybody in, and it worked because Chris is standing there nodding as well.
Right.
Um, but you were in a pretty unique situation in that you got to be up close and personal, watching these two sort of successive, maybe they're not successive generations, but kind
Yeah,
um, of the best American climbers, Boone into Chris. And there was sort of a passing of the torch,
for
at
sure.
Necessary Evil that you were there for.
Yeah.
Um, they're different personalities, but they have some things in common. Was it different shooting the two of them?
I'm obviously really super lucky to have front row seats to that like whole era. And I became pretty almost like I would take it for granted that Chris was going to do something fucking mind blowing every time I shot with him.
Yeah.
And he was like, like you could probably ask Josh Lowell the same thing, but he's one of those dudes that you never ever bet against Chris ever. Like no matter how stupid the thing he's trying looks, how far away from it he seems, how bad the conditions are, how late in the trip, whatever. Like never bet him out because he will blow your fucking mind every time. And it's like his batting average on success to failures is really, really high success rate,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I was really lucky that when we go out and shoot, I knew I was going to get gold somehow. Like we were just going to, like I flew to China and did a shoot with him in Yangshuo, and it was really a recreational trip. It wasn't about climbing hard. It was about introducing harder routes to the climbing scene over there and just kind of being an ambassador to the sport. And still, even then, he was like, every day we'd go out, he'd be like, on-sighting a 14A that was the hardest route to the crag, and then he would put up something next to it that was a 14C that looked throwaway. It looked so easy for him, it's like, and it was just like I did a video with him where we went to Spain, and I shot with he and Dailo Ojeda, and we went to Santolina, and I said, Chris, what are you going to climb on? And he's like, well, I want to try, he was trying oh gosh, what was the route at the point? It was might have been Neanderthal or something he was trying.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and I was like, well, okay, like what's your day gonna look like? You're gonna warm up, like do some warm ups and then chill for a while. And he's like, well, I guess I should warm up. And he never used to warm up, so he's just like, I guess I'll warm up. And he goes over to the left side of the cliff and on sights a 14B, as a warm up. And I was like, I mean, when I was growing up, that kind of shit would make front page hot flashes news. Like that would be like on a casual warm up, he on site to the 14B before he tries his hard route, and it's like, that's just like, that kind of stuff happens all the time with Chris, even still, like in his 40s, he's still doing mind blowing shit.
Yeah. And I mean, to put that in perspective, like we talked about Agincourt earlier, that was the first 14B in France.
Yeah.
Like one of the first 3 in the world, I think, maybe the second or third.
Yeah.
And Chris just doing it as a warm up. That's cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's I've never seen anybody. I mean, for sure, there's so much talent right now that, like, when I go look at social media and see what people are doing now, it's like true, like Sean Bailey, Zach Gala, Nathaniel Coleman, all these American climbers that are so freaking good and so strong, and like they speak climbing so fluently that it's almost like it's hard for me to kind of like put it in perspective how deep the talent pool is now, the skill, the level. But at the time, Chris was so far head and shoulders of everybody else that it was really a special thing to just watch him do his thing. And then even the good climbers who were around were like, I have no idea what he's doing right now, and that's a pretty special era to be in when you have the, and this gets thrown around all the time with sports metaphors, but you've got the Michael Jordan or the Kelly Slater of your sport in front of you live right now. It's not a myth. It's happening in front of you. That's a really special, privileged place to be. I mean, I feel really grateful to know him and to get to be friends with him and to witness so many of these moments with him. Cause it doesn't happen where you have the one person stand above the talent pool so far very often.
Yeah. The whole world talent pool. Amazing. Chris is a little more laid back in my experience anyway, a little more laid back than Boone. And Boone's such an artist with his like own artistic opinions. Was Boone harder to shoot? Like, were there ever arguments about like, no, dude, you should be getting this shot from over there?
No, I mean, Boone's always left me to do my thing. And like, there were times when we were shooting frequent flyers where I was like, I knew Boone was trying a project over there at that end of the other end of the valley or something. And I was, getting some shots of the rest of the crew over here. And I'd be like, Boone, just don't do it till I get there. Because if we don't shoot it, we won't get it, And then he ended up doing this problem called Snake Eyes off camera. And I was like, just tearing my hair out. I'm like, dude, that was like the highlight of this segment. And I don't have it now. And he was like, it was really tweaky, like mono climbing on these small limestone pockets. And he wasn't able to do it again. But he did this rad first ascent of a V10. And I was like, you're killing me, man. But I mean, it's like such a small thing, really. We have plenty of moments. Totally. But I mean, Boone's super easy for me to work with. We have a really secondhand language where we don't really, he lets me do my thing. He does his thing. filming with him was always just more like shooting my friends and super
Yeah.
low key. And all credit to Boone for being the pioneer he was. He didn't have that batting average that Sharma had, where every single time he went out, he was doing a new hard first ascent or a new onsite. Like,
Yeah.
Boone's effort on Super Tweak was his doggedness. It
Mm,
wasn't that route suited him. It was that he just kept going back to it because he knew it was hard and he was at his peak, and he knew that he could do something next level. And what made that ascent really monumental was just that he just kept going back to it until he did it, and
yeah.
it was a multi-year effort. And it's very different style than the way Sharma kind of, until he hit realization, Sharma hadn't ever tried anything that long,
Right.
like he'd do things in a couple of days. And he was doing the hardest things in the country in a couple of days. So,
Yeah.
for Boone, it was more like he was a lot more blue collar about it. It was like he had to like get stronger, go back, be demoralized, multiple seasons, and then finally do it, which is it was a different thing, but it was really cool to see too.
For sure. Were there other moments in your shooting career that you either just, like, didn't have the camera,
Oh, dude,
the memory was gone, the batteries died, and you just missed it?
here's the most embarrassing one. I'll tell you the most embarrassing one. This is where I wanted to like literally like jump off a bridge. I was filming Boone, so I bolted ice cream in hell, and I bolted this thing next to it called Sideshow Bob. And
I didn't know you bolted that.
yeah, so when I was climbing in hell one time, I saw the footholds that people were using for wizards, and I was like, wouldn't it be cool? And this is all British inspired. Like, wouldn't it be cool if you could climb on the footholds of wizards and make a route out of it?
Mm,
Like, if you could climb up those tiny little edges, and essentially that's what ice cream is. Like, I ended up having to reinforce holds with glue because that's the nature of the rock there.
sure.
Essentially, core setting the route, and then I was like, as I did, I would just like hand Boone routes I couldn't do. And I was like, okay, go for it, dude. I think it's hard and I think it'll go. And I'd been doing route setting a lot back then. So I kind of had a sense of what was possible a little bit. So he set to it and ended up doing it. And the day he did it, I filmed it and I was like, this is sick. Like a 14C here in hell. This is amazing. Like it's basically like a V12 boulder problem, and, and because I was shooting on tapes and like there was all this like shuffling of tapes around one way or the other, I ended up recording over the first half of his ascent.
Oh, no.
Yeah, yeah, and like I was
Ah.
like I aged 10 years right then. I was like that. Like I was so like I had to tell Boone. I had to like I was just like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, I couldn't
Oh,
believe I did it. Like, it's like the
no.
number one thing you don't do is put old tapes back in the camera, But I think I was, maybe I might have had a mix up with what I was putting in the camera. Something happened where I just recorded over with something
Yeah.
completely not like useless. It was like, so I ended up editing what's in, I think it was in Movement, Yank on This 3. We ended up putting the ice cream footage out, but it was edited together with earlier footage of his attempts.
Got
So
it.
it's a total, like, it's one of the first times where I was like, I couldn't put the actual send in the film because it was like, I didn't have it. I just literally deleted it essentially. So that was a
Oh, man.
massive fuck up. And I always wish I could have gone back in time and not done that, but whatever. It's how you learn, I guess.
Yeah, for sure, man. I definitely feel that. Like, there are some things in my creative career that I'm like, "Oh, no. How the fuck did I just delete that?" And I can't recover it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel that pain. Uh, what's the most non-Sharma impressive thing you've ever seen? Impressive, improbable, make you wanna, like, look away from the viewfinder and just see it with your own eyes kind of
Hmm.
moment.
You know, um, yeah, there's been a lot. I mean, I shot a little bit with Josh Lowell and Lisa Rands over in the Gritstone when she
Mm.
did Gaia, and that was
Oh,
harrowing to
man.
shoot.
No
Um,
doubt. I'd wanna
I
look
was,
away
yeah,
watching that.
I mean, I was basically like committed to the shoot. I was definitely trying to keep it framed and keep it like like shooting with Josh is always a privilege because he's such a great filmmaker. And but I was like, yeah, it was scary to watch. But
No
I did
doubt.
a shoot for like a behind the scenes shoot for Jimmy Chin's National Geographic cover, his article on Yosemite where it had Alex, standing on the ledge and all that. And
Yep.
I was shooting some footage for that for Camp 4 Collective. And I went out to Separate Reality with Alex and Jimmy and Mikey Schaefer. And I wasn't supposed to be filming the actual ascent. I was just shooting the behind the scenes of it. So it was kind of like the making of the photograph. So, Jimmy's in the back of the cave and Alex goes through it and, has gear, kind of climbs through it, checks it out. And nobody really talked about it, but, we kind of whispered to each other that he was probably going to try to solo it. And I didn't want to think about it because it was like, it's the most
It's so
exposed
exposed.
512.
Yeah.
Like it's so scary, like way up off the deck. Like you wrap into it right off the horizontal earth and then you are immediately, whatever, 1,500 feet above the ground. And I remember being next to Mikey when he was holding a flash for Jimmy and I was just shooting kind of like, the behind the scenes stuff. And I remember seeing him do it. And this was before Free Solo, but I think this was kind of the early connection that Jimmy had with Alex when they first formulated this idea of this film and what Alex really wanted to do, which was obviously Free Solo, El Cap. So that was, I'd filmed with Alex before and I knew he was capable of messed up stuff. Like I had shot some stuff with him in Indian Creek where he did Belly Full of Bad Berries and Air Sweden and some of these things. And it was right before he soloed Touchstone, or not Touchstone, Moonlight Buttress.
Moonlight, yeah.
And it was literally like a week before he soloed that. So I heard that he had soloed Moonlight Buttress a week after we filmed all that stuff in Indian Creek. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? Like hard 512, slippery, parallel sided, multi-pitch, big like, but that set that was the education process for Alex to kind of get, to build to the big real project. And so that was definitely scary.
Oh man, I bet. I can't even imagine. I don't like watching it when my friends are soloing short little things.
Yeah, no.
I can't imagine watching a Separate Reality solo.
Yeah, I mean, and it's been done before. Like it was like I think Wolfgang soloed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even like that hard of a route, really. It's hard to wrap your head around how fucking exposed that is, and like you can't help but picture like there's the roof, and then there's this 45-degree slab below it, just barely covering the edge of the boulder problem. But essentially, you can just picture the body going down 45 whatever feet, bouncing off the 45-degree slab and just ejecting straight out over the abyss. And there's just no stopping your momentum. Like you're not going to grab a tree or anything. You're just going to eject straight out over the abyss and just go 1,500 feet or whatever to your death. Like,
oh man,
it's just hard not to picture that stuff.
For sure. Is there an early Sharma moment that stands out? Like, obviously, he's Chris Sharma. He's always been Chris Sharma. And when he first burst onto the scene, he was already impressing and surprising everybody. But before you really understood that his batting average was so high, was there a moment that really stood out to you?
Man, honestly, it goes back to the very beginning when I first met him. The first trip that we shot him on Necessary Evil, we heard about this kid that had done Super Tweak, and he was now down in the VRG, and he was going to try Boone's project, Necessary Evil. And so Boone and I just barreled down there, like, okay, let's see this for ourselves, and we got to shoot this kid. Like, it's like hearing about Bruce Lee before you met him. It's like, let's go see what this is all about.
Right.
So, and also it was kind of like there had been a lot of like wunderkind rumors, like people that were like supposed to be the next big thing coming out of the gym generation, and you'd hear about them, and some of them were really pretty strong, but like not a lot of them lived up to their promise to that point. I mean, they were definitely strong kids, but it wasn't like a leapfrog level. Right. But we got down there and saw Chris, met him, and he was just really young and just so like innocent and kind of a punky little kid, like kind of a trash talker and just punk. And he tried to warm up. Like it was, again, one of those things where it's like, well, dude, are you going to warm up? And he's like, oh, I guess. I mean, what should I do? And Boone's like, well, that's, that's the fall of man. That's like a 13B. And if you just do it to the first anchor, it's like 11D or something, or 12A or something. And you can just warm up on that, and Chris goes up on it and falls off of it like 4 times. Like, he's so pumped, dude. He couldn't even, like, he could barely get to the first anchor. He was so pumped. He was like, just Coke bottled pumped. And I was like looking at Boone like, this is the fucking future. Like, what the fuck? Like, that's 11 fucking D, and and then he literally, like, as pumped as he was, he literally just like pulled the rope, tied in. And I don't remember if he did it that try or the next try, but he like basically did it just completely pumped stupid off this 12A warm up, and did, the first ascent of the, first American 514C first ascent, and it's like, then we got it. Then it was kind of like, oh, he just was bored. Like that,
Yeah.
there were too many
Yeah.
holds on that route for him. Like he grabbed all the holds instead of just being specific. Like
He
it
had
was
no
pretty
reason to
clear.
focus.
Yeah, like he was just distracted. It was like, it's like, having Einstein do basic long division. It's like, doesn't make sense to him.
Totally. Wow, that's amazing. It's funny how, like, the belief that those guys have, that, "Oh, I'm
Yeah,
stupid pumped. I'm just gonna pull the rope and go anyway."
yeah, yeah,
Like, nowadays, our, like, adherence to better tactics would force us to rest for an hour,
right.
um, and it just didn't matter. Didn't
Yeah.
matter to him at all.
Well, that's the thing I think that goes all the way back again too, that that set Chris apart and changed climbing forever, which was the controlled ethic of the French technique focus of the 80s and the 90s, and this idea of like being so like overwhelmingly technical and precise, and that's
Yeah,
what everyone understood to be good climbing. Chris threw all that out the window and just got ugly with it. Like, he just showed his
yeah,
game face and just decided, if I can grab that hold, then I can grab the next hold, and that's all that fucking matters. And that's what Chris, he took the seriousness out of climbing to this, like, where it was so cerebral and everybody was trying to make it so like, oh, I need to work on my footwork because that's what everybody says I should do. It's like, Chris was like, you know what? Actually, if I take less time putting my foot on that crappy sloper and I just jump to the next hole to campus through, I'm done with the route while you're still thinking about it. And
right,
that
right.
mentality of like carelessness, or like, again, non-preciousness, really was, it changed the attitude of an entire generation of climbers. And it's
Yeah,
still to this day, like, if you look at a run and jump problem in the gyms at the comp style problems, it's like, you have to have that abandon to be able to succeed. You can't be controlled. You have
yeah,
to let that go. You have to let it go and take the brakes off. Just like, and I think Chris was the first person I'd ever seen do that and prove his theory. Prove, like, and he wasn't out to prove anything. He was just doing his natural thing. But to see him do that, it was like all that other crap that was being talked about, that was my generation, was like technical, controlled, like having good technique was a thing. It was like, people would talk shit about other people that didn't have good technique, and then Chris came along with ostensibly bad technique and kicked everybody's asses. So it was like,
yeah.
okay, well,
I
that theory's
I
out the
remember
window.
hearing all the old dudes in the gym be like, "Oh, that kid doesn't have footwork. Wait till he gains some
Yeah,
weight, you know?
yeah, yeah, totally.
Wait till he doesn't weigh 98 pounds. He's
Yep,
never gonna be able to rock climb."
yep, totally. I mean, that's what made Best of the West so fun, was he was like freaking huge. He was yoked,
Yeah,
like he had
yep,
so much muscle, and everybody was like, well, he's washed up now. Like, there's no way he's going to do the same thing, because we'd seen it so many times. Like, young climbers who are really strong, super light, they get to be grown-ups and they can't figure out how to move that mass around, right?
mhm,
But Chris could. I mean, he got strong. He
yeah.
got better, actually.
Do you have a favorite of your films?
Um, well, Frequent Flyers changed my life in terms of the course of it, so that one's always enduring for me. Best of the West was really, I think, one of my favorite um, projects, because it was so like, we only shot for 10 days, and what we came out with was that film, and it was just stacked with all the right people, um, in an incredible venue, um, like climbing with the best climber in the world at the time, and the vibe of it was right, using Fugazi as a soundtrack, everything about that um, I feel like it was a pretty complete film on its own. Like, I feel like it's rewatchable, and um, I'm always proud to hear, like, when somebody tells me, like, I think maybe it was Leif Gash or something was telling me that they have an inaugural viewing of Best of the West whenever the season opener is in Waco. And it's like that kind of shit warms my heart, because it's like to be in that world-class area and have people look at that as nostalgic but important is really cool for me. I mean, it's like, not going to lie, it means a lot to me that people would actually care enough to watch these old handmade climbing videos.
Yeah, totally. Well, question real quick was Sharma doing Just Do It in Fast Twitch?
In Fast Twitch, yep. Yep.
There's a scene in that I've always thought was hilarious, and you were close to Dale, so I'm curious what your reaction was during that scene. Like, Dale looks completely fucking incensed that Sharma is taking his shirt off
Yeah.
on the route. He's
So
basically like, he's just disrespecting it.
yeah, yeah.
know?
Well, he wasn't meaning to, I'm sure, but also
Right,
he was a
right,
punk. Like, he didn't give a shit. Like, 13C is easy for him, and that's the first part of that route is 13C. And
right.
for him, he's like on a good hold, and he's just stemming. He's like, I'm hot. I'm gonna take my sweatshirt off, And I think Dale, his attitude in the interview that we did, which was never meant to be on camera, by the way, it was meant to be just voiceover. But I loved some of the like
Yeah.
faces that these guys made. But Dale, I think Dale's just an analyst, and he's a very, just an analytical climber, and he looks
Yeah.
at why something worked for somebody. And he was very much of that old school, like, camp that we were just talking about, where technique is everything, like
Totally.
technique, like use your footwork, and I think he was maybe not incensed, but I think it was just like flabbergasted that he was seeing what he was seeing, because Dale had been actively trying that route for a couple of years. And at the time, Dale was one of the best climbers in the world. Like, he was certainly one of the top 3 or 4 climbers in the States. And, he obsessed about that route. Dale did. Like, he made impressions of the holds and created tinfoil replicas for training on at home. I mean, he was obsessed. And so to see Chris just piss on it like that was just like, it's just literally like letting somebody like understand that time travel is possible. Like, he was just like, what? Like watching Chris just like take it so lightly that he could
Yeah.
take his shirt off midway through the route on his red point go.
Yeah.
It's just like, holy crap, like, game over, man. Like, this is the new way.
There's an interesting parallel to that moment that really fascinates me, and I'm embarrassed actually that I didn't ask Adam specifically about this moment. Adam Ondra, I talked to him about Just Do It for, it's coming up next month. And he says that he purposely didn't watch any of the film of Just Do It so that he could try to onsite it someday.
Mhm.
And in the video of him on-siting it, he's talking about it, and he says, "Yeah, I had planned when I got to that hold to take my shirt off, take my sweater off." Like, he had planned that from the ground.
Wow.
Like,
No
I'll get a
way.
rest there. I'm gonna start with my layer on.
Right,
I'm gonna
right.
get to that hold. I'm gonna remove the layer and continue climbing,
Wow. Not knowing that Chris had done that.
not knowing that Chris had done that.
Wow.
And I was
That's
like,
funny.
"Wow, this is a weird, like, um,
Yeah, it's
this
like
weird adaptation that climbers have made. Now we can see there's
right.
this rest I'm gonna remove my shirt at." And at the time when Chris did it, it was mind-blowing.
Yep.
Like everyone who watched that footage laughed out loud when Chris took his
Yep.
fucking shirt off.
Yep. Because it's so monumental, and yet he's so trivial about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool that he did that. Like, he isolated himself from all the footage of Just Do It. I mean, that route was has so much like myth
Yeah.
to it. And
Yeah.
Jesus, man, like, I actually talked to Jibe about when he first saw that route, and he had done the first 14A in America on with To
Mhm.
Boulder Not to Be,
Bolt.
and so he had a real affinity for Smith Rocks, and he knew he could climb well there, and he was really good at crimping.
Mhm.
And for him, it was really, really important to do that route. And it was an Alan Watts route, but Jibe did it first, and it was cool to talk to him about it, because I grew up, I remember that magazine cover with Jibe doing the match move on that route. Yeah, that one. And just staring at that and just being like, that's 14C. Holy shit. Like,
Yeah.
So it had this built up reputation, and then for Chris to go there and just basically piss on it was just so cool. I mean, it was just like it's literally like a if Necessary Evil 2 weeks earlier hadn't established it, this verified it. Like,
Yeah.
nobody had repeated Necessary Evil, so nobody really knew how hard that thing was at the time. But Just Do It was a known thing. People had
Mhm.
tried it. Like Mark Leministrel did the second ascent of it and was like, and these are the best climbers in the world at the time. It's like this is hard.
Yeah, totally. Just a whole new it's cool that the next generation had that, like I don't even know if it's belief or lack of lack of a barrier, like, just
Mhm.
Chris just didn't even know that he was supposed to not be able to do that.
Yeah, and he was confident, and I always wonder, like when you watch somebody like Kelly Slater or Michael Jordan or Chris do their sports, if they just look at the rest of us and shake their heads and they're confused why it's so hard for us because it doesn't feel the
Yeah,
same for them. I mean,
yeah,
I think for Chris, he saw things like Super Tweak as just a fun thing to do for an afternoon. It wasn't like a
right,
monumental project. It was just like, okay, well, where's all the hardest stuff? Point me to the
yeah,
hardest stuff. I'll do all the hardest stuff, and then I'll be the best climber. And it was like that simple. It was like, and it wasn't about, well, I wonder if I can do this. It was like, okay, like Chris just
yeah,
didn't, he never had this barrier in his brain, like he wasn't going to be able to climb something.
totally. Well, with, like I don't wanna take up too much more of your time, we're way over already, but, um, traveling around with, like, Chris, when he's young, you know, Obi, all these guys, I'm sure there was some debauchery happening that probably should better be left untold. Um, but were there any stories that came out of those travels that are particularly memorable for you?
I mean, debauchery, it has to be the PCA is probably the most debauchery.
Mm, we didn't even get into the PCA,
Yeah.
geez.
The PCA had some legendary after parties and stories leading up to the comps that were, yeah. I mean, I probably can't say too much about some of that stuff, but um, that I mean, it was a golden era for sure. It was definitely, um,
PCA, what about Nels beating Chris?
yeah, yeah.
That
Nels
was
was
in
a
Salt
beast,
Lake,
man.
right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Nelly was like certainly like one of the top three boulders in the country at the time. Maybe I mean, in that competition, you had Malcolm Smith and you had I think
Yeah, that's
Francois
right.
competed, and I mean, you had I think Clem was competing. Like we had a murderer's row of male side talent on that comp when Nels beat Chris, and like yeah, like John Stack was a beast. I mean, these guys were freaking strong, all of them. Stephen Jeffrey. I mean, there was like pretty much all the best climbers in the like. Well, everybody that came to the trade shows were professional
Yep.
climbers, and they always happened to coincide with these trade shows. So you had really really deep talent, like. But I mean, yeah, it was cool. Nelly, like I went up to Saskatoon to shoot with him. I wanted to do a film about Nels, but he had kind of bad luck with his shoulders and ended up kind
Mm,
of like never getting back to his peak after that period of time. And he still loves climbing. He still climbs. Like we shot Perfecto with him,
right.
but yeah, he was at such a high level back then. I mean, he was just like talk about somebody who was just didn't know he wasn't able he shouldn't be able to compete with these guys. Like he's just from a
Yeah.
farm town in
Right.
Canada and
Right.
trained on these little tiny scruffy walls and came out stronger than everybody.
Yeah. Well, man, I appreciate this conversation. Even though we didn't get into PCA much, we didn't talk Climax Media much or Momentum Video Magazine. There's so much more of what you've done and contributed to climbing. And in particular, like one of the reasons I'm doing this series is because like the 70s Yosemite scene has been done to death. Like
Hmm.
we've got those stories. We've heard those stories. They've been romanticized and mythologized, and I love those stories,
Hmm.
Um, Yosemite in general. But the stories from like the early days of sport climbing and the early days of comp climbing, haven't been mythologized in the same way, and I think they
Right.
deserve to be. Um, and when I started this series, it was like, I'm gonna choose 10 ascents, and that proved to be fucking impossible. Like, it's
Yeah.
so hard to talk about just 10 things from this whole decade.
Yeah.
Um, and so many different players have gotten involved, which is cool. So I appreciate you sitting down and like bringing in some of those other players that maybe weren't the like top moment of the decade or top 10 moments of the decade. They're still massively important. Like the impact Boone had on American climbing and your documenting of what was going on then. Um, and you know, like I said in the intro, the from crash pads to big holds to that those comps that changed the direction of climbing in America. Um, so thank you not only for sitting down and talking about this, but for doing what you did all those years ago.
It was my pleasure. Yeah, I'm glad that you're doing this series. I think it is a really interesting era in climbing, and I'm glad that it's getting looked at. Getting analyzed a little bit.
Thanks, Mike, man.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush and Emily Holland for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. At the link in your show notes, you'll find all the things you expect, probably some you don't, including a link to Mike's film, The Artist, as well as a link to that list of 90s climbing films and videos that you can watch right now today. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, and tell everyone you know at the gym, at the crag, at all of those social functions where people are just miming beta to each other. And together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners, Merry Christmas. Thanks for being here. Whether you're listening on Christmas or not, thank you for being here. And thanks to Mike Call for doing this. Wow, that was really fun. I've actually listened back to this conversation multiple times already, partly for editing, but I find myself like getting lost in the conversation and realizing I haven't done any editing for the last 20 minutes. So this was a really fun one. I'm not going to take up a bunch of time today because, well, it's Christmas Eve when I'm recording this. So it's Christmas Day maybe when you're listening to it. And I need to get to some other things. But I do want to say, if you haven't joined over at the Patreon, it's free to join and join in the conversation over there. I would love to get your input on what we're going to be listening to next season. I've already cooked up quite a few, actually, maybe too many. I'm going to get yelled at for this, but I've already cooked up a bunch of bonus episodes for patrons. Haven't made them. I shouldn't say cooked up. I've imagined what they're going to be. So there are going to be some really fun mini episodes over there pretty soon, theoretically, assuming I'm not overworking myself, which is entirely possible. All right, that's at patreon.com/Secret Stoners Club, all one word. Go join. I'll see you guys next week when we are starting the new year off with the first 14C in America. All right. See you guys then. Bye.